great. Thanks for coming. Thanks for having me. I've been doing a few of these, well, more than a few of these, and still haven't really got used to talking to myself in my front room. So bear with me. I also tried some different formats. I would typically not have any slides, and I did one without slides the other day, and it felt better. So I hope you can bear staring at me for a bit. I'm gonna not talk for like an hour because that seemed long generally, but particularly when we're all sitting around a computer screen. So to also give some time for Q&A as well. I think it's important to have some questions and hopefully have some discussion and some pushbacks as well. So I'm going to outline some of the key things about the moment that we're in, and also particularly talk about the university sector. Obviously, we work in universities. I was going to say we're in universities, but I guess most of us aren't. Like I said, I'm at home there, but certainly within the university infrastructure, at least, I guess. Yeah, so I think the first thing to acknowledge is the Black Lives Matter moment, right? I wouldn't say we're in the moment, but it's possible the moment already passed. I'm not 100% sure that we're still there, but let's be more positive and assume we are still in this Black Lives Matter moment. And there's been a renewed focus since June on issues of race, racism. Maybe renewed is, I'm really trying to be optimistic. Renewed might be too optimistic. There has been a focus on race, racism, some of the terms like structural racism. In fact, I do a lot of engagement in like public media, etc. And the conversations were very, very, very different in the summer. Very different to the point where we were talking about the actual term structural racism was used. I don't know if I don't actually watch Good Morning Britain. I appear on it quite a lot, but I've never actually watched it. But I actually found myself agreeing with Piers Morgan almost every time I was on the show. It was really disturbing kind of experience. So the conversation definitely shifted a lot. In some ways, it shifted back. So it didn't take that long for us to start talking about things like what was it? There was a big controversy a couple of weeks ago was Rule Britannia at the proms and these kind of really culture war debates. It didn't take long to get back there, but still, we have had at least a discussion about racism. There's been more reports there's been more reports on racism in the last few months than there's been in the last several years, generally. There's just been one out about from the Universities UK, which I will talk about specifically. There was a COVID report about racial disparities. There's currently a review being done on ethnic disparities that they're looking for evidence for. So there's lots of discussion. Even institutions like Lloyd's of London, which typically had always avoided any conversation of things like reparations, are now talking about recognizing their past and things. So there's English Heritage have talked about the fact that a third of their property portfolio was owned by slave owners. So we're certainly different, right? And universities has been part of this kind of move to let's discuss the issue of racism. I think it's important. I've kind of tried to be positive. It's going to get really negative, but it might get better at the end, hopefully. It is important to note though that because talking about racism isn't necessarily a good thing. In fact, talking about racism can often be a bad thing. It can actually make things worse. Many times it actually makes things worse rather than makes things better, unfortunately. If we look at the history of a history of this moment, actually, because it's some ways none of this is really different. It feels different, but it's not. There have been mass mobilizations around issues of racism in the UK specifically. Sorry, I'm in a funny place in my house. I've got lights shining by. There's been numerous mass mobilizations about race and racism in the UK. People on the streets. The only real difference with what happened in June is that you had there were a lot more white people involved, right? 4 years ago we had the Black Lives Matter marches. Around exactly the same thing happened. There was Philando Castile was bleeding out on Facebook in Minnesota, and thousands of people went onto the streets. But it didn't catch mainstream attention. This caught mainstream attention, and we've seen it as this watershed moment. But if you look at some of the upheavals historically in the UK, this doesn't really rank. So in the 80s, there was a number of rebellions where Brixton in 1981, Handsworth and Brixton again in 1985, where whole days-long rebellions where things were shut down, and it was much more substantive in a very real sense in the impact that they had. And after all of those things happened, there were reports there that they talked about on the news. There was, we've had the Scarman report 81. We had the Swan report in higher education 85. There's McPherson report in 99. There's always report. Like, one of the things that Britain likes to do is write reports, and write reports about racism in particular. So in some ways, I'm looking at this moment saying it doesn't seem that different. It seems largely similar. And there is a question to what extent we really learn from that past, because we seem to have almost entirely forgotten it, right? Particularly if you talk about the mainstream engagement, there seems to be a really strong forgetting of all of that. I'm going to share my screen briefly because I did. One of the things that we're doing is we have started a website that we call Make It Plain. So one of the things I do we do the university stuff, and then there's also this site that we call Make It Plain. It's kind of a community radical. We call it the home of Black radical thought. Kind of stuff I can't always get published in the Guardian. Accessible writings about things. I made it today particularly because I am going to. There's an article I haven't. It's written. It's not published about the racial relations. Well, I actually called it the equalities industrial complex, and the history of it, where it comes from, how we are now, and why this actually isn't the moment we think it is. But the site generally has a lot of different conversations about things like the US election, Barbados, and stuff like that. It's just, if people might be interested in having a look and check it out, it's all the link in the chat if I can copy and paste. So yeah, it's a moment where we do have to think, I think, carefully about where we are and what we want, because obviously as universities, the universities have responded. Certainly, we did have the report. What sparked me to write this article today for the website was the Universities UK report. I'm sure you've seen, into racial harassment on campus. This followed on from last year when the EHRC, Equality Human Rights Commission, did a report that highlighted just how much racial harassment there was on campus. I think we tend to think that that's kind of old school, the idea of people feeling uncomfortable about race and being like personally abused is gone. It actually hasn't gone. I can't remember from last year, it was like a third of staff felt they'd been racially harassed, something like that. So the good side of the report was it highlighted that the experiences that people are having are still there, they haven't gone anywhere. The bad side of the report was it also equated anti-Welsh prejudice with racism, and also really dealt with, this is one of the things we haven't learned, and I think if we're going forward and thinking about what universities can do, there is this framing of racism as the individual acts that bad people do, right? So there are racist people, and if you can stop racist people being racist, then racism will disappear, right? This is the number one worst way to understand the problem of racism, which isn't about individuals, it's about systems. And actually, if you look at the legal framework around this, from the Racial Relations Act in 65 to the reports that we're having today, you can really see that it is actually still about this idea that there are bad racist people. If you can stop them being racist, there is no problem anymore. This is the whole problem with the framing of racial harassment as being the issue. Racial harassment is an issue, don't get me wrong, but it's actually not, it's not the issue, and it really isn't how we should be talking about the problem. So if you look at the report, and I've had a quick skim, I didn't read the whole thing, but look at the executive summary. The stuff they're suggesting, it's all good stuff, right? That you should have a tool to report racism. One of the things to think about as an institution is, do you have a tool to where staff could report, or staff or students could report issues of racial harassment? Probably not. Most places don't, right? This is a very basic thing you could do, just to bring in racial reporting. Problem is though, once you do report, what happens, right? Because that was the other part of the report from last year, was even when people do report stuff, there doesn't tend to be much follow through. I've had this experience recently, actually, where you report something, it just doesn't go anywhere. There's no actual proper process for it to be dealt with, right? So there are huge problems with this. But if you look at other sectors where racial report has been brought in, I did some work with the prison service. Actually, the prison service is actually one where they do have very, 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 very clear racial reporting. Yeah, there's forms for it. You write it out, etc. And the role I had for this prison was on there. They had a board of people who came and looked at the reports to make sure everything was dealt with properly and effectively. And it all sounds good, right? And I was like, yeah, this would be great. I can get involved with this. It'd be great. 80% of the reports that came in were from white inmates who were complaining of racism. Right? I mean, that's how they define racism in the system. It effectively was, and on the most basic level, if you feel that you have been racially abused, then therefore it is something you should write down. You should write down. And what was actually happening in this was it was being abused by the white inmates to say that they're not getting preferential treatment, etc., etc., etc. But that is kind of the framework that we have, right? That if you feel that it's been, then that's what racism is. It is still in the very individual experience. So the suggestions that you get from that with this framework is always about can we legislate out racism? Can we train? So training becomes a big thing. Can we train people not to be racist? It really is about the individual, when actually there are much bigger problems afoot, if you like. And one of the things you can see really strongly with the new regime, I don't say new regime, the equalities regime that we're in at the minute, is one, it's individual, and two, doesn't actually like to use the term racism. Like, if you actually look at the government report that they're currently doing is called a review of ethnic disparities. That's what they've called it, ethnic disparities. The Equality and Human Rights Commission is doing is looking at the impact of COVID, on the ethnically differential impact on COVID. And this is a true story. I was just recently, the EHRC had asked me to come and do a talk for them about institutional racism. And so I'm literally getting ready to do the talk. An hour before the talk, I get a phone call from the people who work there saying, we're going to have to cancel because we don't think it's appropriate, because in this COVID report on essentially on racism and COVID, the EHRC had decided they were banning the use of the term either institutional racism or structural racism. We're literally not going to be allowed to be used to understand a problem which is clearly about institutional racism or structural racism. And the people who are organizing the talk thought it would just be, why are we bringing you in? This is clearly nonsense. We're not, as an institution, we're just not at all on the same page. So I didn't do the talk. Right? And that was this month. That was just happened. And if you actually read the, I could find the link and put it in afterwards. You read the terms of reference. It literally does, the word racism does not come up in the EHRC's terms of reference for their review into COVID ethnic disparities. So the language that we're talking about here has taken racism out, has made it individual prejudice, and this is something that in the uni sector we should definitely be trying to avoid. But it's just the worst way to understand the problem. In fact, it's worse than it's not just you don't understand the problem, you actually make the problem worse, because then we misidentify what the issues are. So thinking about universities then, I think it is important to say, well, look, we have this Black Lives Matter agenda. I mean, I suppose Cambridge probably has thought about this, but BCU certainly has talked about this. I wouldn't go as far to say we've thought about this, but there's certainly been talk about this. We have actually, one of the things that happened is we do have now a racial incident, that's what they call racial incident reporting form that you can now fill in. For some reason, it doesn't actually go to the Quality and Diversity Committee. It goes to HR, I think, is the first port of call for this report. And then eventually HR weed out the bad ones, and it goes to the Equality and Diversity Committee, which seems odd to me, but I guess I'm no expert, so what do I know, right? But but we have something, right? That's kind of one of the things that we looked at. But the question you really want to ask when looking at the university is to put these experiences of racial harassment into the context, the wider institutional context of the university. One of the things which you always see with the way these things are dealt with is because we have this kind of idea that racism looks this particular way. Sorry, I'm going to talk about this slide. Sorry, hopefully that's better. So because because we have this like really clear kind of idea about what racism is. Racism is when somebody calls you the N-word, or racism is when someone's overtly racist to you. Is that the reports that really don't have anywhere to go are those reports where it's obviously an incident of racism, but it's not, somebody hasn't been overtly racist towards you, right? So for instance, as a Black professor, if I'm in a meeting with somebody and we're having a disagreement, and it's like, oh, you're being aggressive and you're being threatening. This happens to be a lot, actually. That would have a conversation, right? Well, this happens to Black people, Black men particularly, disproportionately, because there's an assumption that you're aggressive and you're violent, you're gonna kick off at any moment. And so those kind of things. So when you report that, what does the university do? They just go, oh, it's nothing, right? It's fine, right? And it's those kind of things that are allowed to carry on. How are they allowed to carry on, etc. But it's because we have this really kind of unhelpful way of thinking about what racism is. I always say you should separate out racism and prejudice. So prejudice, I might not like lots of different people for lots of different reasons, or groups of people. That's not racism though, because it has no power towards it. All right. The example I give actually would be go back to one of the foundational reports in British racial relations, the Stephen Lawrence McPherson report, was the murder of Stephen Lawrence is huge for lots of reasons. The racist murder is terrible, etc., etc. But that's not what makes it. It's not that people killed him because he was Black that made this stand out and memorable, right? That happens, unfortunately. What made it stand out was that the police didn't investigate the killing properly because they assumed his friend was involved. They assumed it was Black on Black violence. They let the killers, because of that, the killers went free. Some of the killers actually all went free, full stop, but not to this day have not been put in prison. So in that case, we say the prejudice was there was a group of white young people who were prejudiced against Black people and therefore stabbed Stephen Lawrence. That's prejudice, right? If they had they been arrested, charged, and punished as they should have been, would have ended there, would have carried on, etc., etc. Right? It becomes racist because of their action and prejudice is essentially supported tacitly by the police, right? Who allow them to get away with it, who allow that to be condoned. That's where the racism comes in, because there's a system in place which allows that prejudice to survive. So the actual act itself is prejudice. The act itself is not racist. The act itself is prejudice. It's the system around it which makes it racist, if that makes sense. And so sometimes you can't get rid of prejudice. It's not going to happen. Like, you're always going to have some people who don't like some people because of lots of other reasons, etc. But that's not racism. And if you think about, and this is, and you can see how badly the law applies this, because the laws we actually have against racism are actually laws against prejudice. So if you say something anti-white, that is seen to be the same way as saying something anti-Black. Both are prejudiced. One is racist, one is not racist, right? So actually when they first brought in the Racial Relations Act in 1965, some of the first people, actually the majority, like more than some, like a big chunk of the first people who were prosecuted under the new laws around racial discrimination were Black power activists, right? Like they were taken into custody, saying, look, this is anti-white, you can't do this, right? And look, nobody should be in favor of anti-white prejudice. But anti-white prejudice isn't racism. There's nothing to back it up, no support for it. There's no institutional mechanisms that allow for it, right? So we have to see these things as very, very, very different. But what we've essentially done is we've conflated prejudice with racism, but they are two very, very, very distinct things, right? And what we try to do with the frameworks and with the institutions is try to outlaw prejudice and get rid of prejudice, but forgotten that prejudice wasn't really the problem. Well, prejudice is a problem, don't get me wrong, but the problem was the structures, right? The institutions. And we've done very little really on the institutional framework. In fact, I'm not sure we've really done anything really on if you look at the institutional framework. So let's take the universities, for example. Universities are definitely more diverse now than they were 50 years ago by every metric, right? 50 years ago, what, 5% of the population went to university. It really was rich white men who went to universities, with a few notable exceptions, right? And then there is this kind of process of opening up, widening participation, women, poor people, Black people, etc., starts to happen. So there's more diverse. It looks a lot different, particularly since 1992, where you have a whole new universities, etc. It's definitely diverse. Now, is it any less institutionally racist though? Well, let's think about, because student, as a student, not the student. If you look at the student body, it can often feel like it is. You know, Black students are actually overrepresented in university numbers. There's more, like you're more likely to go to university if you're Black than the average white student. There's more of us per number in the general population. But they look at the way in which that was done. So you have these elite universities, which are predominantly white middle class institutions, for more time than you have not had them, right, in terms of the history of universities. In the 90s, there's an effort to say, well, let's open up the universities, bring in more diversity. So what do we do? We say, well, let's open it up and make sure that we get the diversity into the elite institutions? No, right? It's a completely opposite. What we actually do is say, let's create a whole raft of new universities, and we'll put all the diversity into the new universities. This is my university. I like my university. I like working at my university. Birmingham City University is a new university. It's only been a university since '92. About half of our students are from ethnic minority. 65% in the faculty of business law and social sciences are from an ethnic minority. If you compare that to the more established elite university across the road, University of Birmingham, I mean, we have crazy. This literally, like, we account for most of the diversity in the city of students, right? And if you look at the league table of universities, it really is a league table of white supremacy, right? I mean, the top universities are the place with the least diversity. The universities like mine at the bottom of the pile are the ones with the most diversity. Like, it's that simple. Like, we've literally created a structure of widening participation, which is highly, deeply racialized. It's changed a little bit towards the top to some extent, but not really, right? If the places of predominant places of diversity are the places that are lower down the league table, to the point where I've had so if you think about the way the league tables work, right? So the league tables, through the really key metrics of the league tables, are student attainment, right? But what do we know about student attainment? If you're non-white, you are significantly less likely to get a good degree. Even students who do well in school and college, when they come into university, compared to white, generally speaking, across the board, even at my uni, which is predominantly a minority, less likely to get a good degree, right? So the other thing which is really important in league table rankings would be destination leavers. Where do you go to afterwards? Again, look at the statistics. Far less likely to be employed if you're from a minority, and far less likely to be employed in a graduate job, right? So there's two measures. If my uni is predominantly half ethnic minority versus a university with like 10% minority, you're always at a disadvantage. Straight away, you're at a disadvantage. This is going to have an impact on your league table position because of those structural inequalities. So I actually have heard anecdotally, at least one university, you've seen this data and said, look, if we want to go up the league table, what's the surest way you can go up the league table, given those demographics, is to reduce the number of minority ethnic students you have in your university, because that would automatically lead to an increase, right? Because of the metrics and because of structural inequality. And I actually do know of a university, but I will not name, who the leaders of that university were talking about this. How can we dissuade minority students, ethnic students, from coming to university, because this is a guaranteed route to going up the league table. Like, that's the system of diversity that we have. It's not about equality at all. We've essentially entrenched equality within the way that we've opened up and diversified universities, and then we kind of celebrate it and go, look, isn't the sector diverse? And that's the part of the sector that looks like it's doing a lot better. If you look at staff, it's completely different. So if you look at staff, I'm not sure how we could see this. It's better again. Like, it's not. If you look 50 years ago, it would certainly be a lot worse. It may have slightly improved in the last 10 years, but let's just take for Black staff only represent about 1% of the entire population of academics. Right, we're about 3% of the population, 1% of academic staff. Then you have this problem with seniority. So the higher up you go, there's less and less people. 20,000 full professors in the country, in any university, in any subject, 140 of which are Black, right? That's a massive underrepresentation. And about 35, 40 of them are women. Right? So you've got a huge, massive problem of representation higher up, I mean, in general, higher up, in the sector. I mean, to the point, I was doing I want to finish it. I never got around to finishing it because I was starting to do another project. But at one point, I wanted to count the amount of Black sociologists. So I'm before Professor of Black Studies, I was a sociologist, worked in sociology, and was trying to count how many people are actually employed in sociology. Black people have lecturer, senior lecturer, professor of sociology in the United Kingdom. I got to 15. 15 is my number I got to. Let's say I didn't get everybody. Let's say there were 20, right? At this point, 6 of those, including myself, worked at Birmingham City University. So our one department of university accounted for about a quarter of all Black sociologists in the entire country. I mean, that's how bad it is. It's terrible. One of the reasons we have the main reason we have the only Black Studies program is the only university, the only department that hires enough people who could possibly deliver a 3-year degree. Like honestly, like it's terrible. Just think about the department that you see. There's very unlikely to be a Black person in it, and it'd be almost. Do I know any? Do I know? I'm trying to do it. I think I know one other department that has 2 Black people, like one that I can think of. Maybe there's others, but 3, 4, 5 critical mass, very unlikely. This is actually when we say why is there only one Black Studies program, that's why. It's the only university that hires enough people to do it. In fact, if I compare to the university, but I did my PhD at the University of Birmingham, so I feel like I can talk about it. I spent a long time in the university, and I mean, the College of Social Sciences, which employs about 100 people, has 1 Asian person part-time, and that's the diversity. I mean, that's today. That's not 2030. That's today, right? We actually have more Black people working in our one department than probably work as academic staff in whole faculties, colleges, in other universities. It really is appalling. And that's just the employment level. So when you start to go higher, it gets even worse. And then think about management. I've been the most senior Black person at BCU since I started, and I wasn't that senior when I started, right? I mean, that's how bad its management level is really, 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 really bad. Is there now because people move and change. I don't think there's currently a vice chancellor of a university who was Black in the UK. I don't think so. Usually there was Baroness Amos at SOAS, but she left. So I don't think there is. Maybe there's one I'm missing, but that's the level that we're talking about. Really, really, really underrepresented. And so we probably shouldn't be surprised at some of the issues in the university haven't necessarily changed, right? So when we're thinking about racism and we're thinking about how do we deal with it, these are kind of the more structural things we need to be looking at, right? Where are our students located? Who's in jobs, but not just who's in jobs, where are they in jobs? So for example, even if you go back to that split of post-92 elite, and also think about Black academic staff. Most of the Black academic staff I know work in post-92. I work in post-92. Most of them work in post-92, or work in subjects that aren't the core subjects. This is why I was really interested in sociology specifically. So my first job was in early childhood education and care, which I actually know very little about. I essentially blagged. I sweet talk my way out to the course. But I know very few people, Black people in particular, who've gone straight into sociology, history, psychology. It's very, very rare. Most of us have started in the new universities, have started in these more vocational subjects, and eventually maybe you come back into, but I'm not 100% sure. Even now, I'd probably get a job, but it takes you to be that level to be able to slide over. So there's huge problems if you look at location about where people are. So what you essentially have in the UK more broadly is this 2-track system of the elite universities, which have more resources, are generally more elite, class-wise, race-wise, certainly. Mostly diversity is imported, right? So it's actually interesting because places like the University of Birmingham, places like the elite have diversity, but it tends to be fee-paying students from different countries, right? I went to the University of Bath, I think I should say, for my undergraduate degree, and there were the year I started, I was one of 6 African Caribbean students in the whole entire first year. Like literally, there was me and 5 other people. At a time when the university was 20% Chinese students. So it's not that there's no diversity, but you have to look at what is that diversity mean? What is that diversity telling us? So there's really are these deep kind of structural problems with the way that the with the way that the university works. So I guess thinking about what can we do about it would be the question which on everybody's mind. So what's the solution? So I think really importantly we have to separate out these. There's some ideas to think through. So we're talking now about decolonizing the universities, kind of the language is being used. I'm always wary about using that word decolonization because decolonization that's a radical idea. That's an idea that says we need to overthrow, we need to completely reform, to transform what the universities look like and really think about these big ideas, etc., etc. Which we're just not do. Let's just be honest and say, looking at the reading list that's not decolonizing. That's a useful thing to do. It is not it's not a decolonial thing to do. Malcolm X, who I actually have spoken for ages and not mentioned Malcolm X, which is rare, definitely rare for me, said in the 60s that this word revolution has been misused, and we are really misusing this word decolonize. Decolonize is a radical overturn. Really means you can't. If you think about the university and why it still has all of these inequalities in it, why they're still so strongly embedded, because of what the university is. There is this kind of mythology around the university that's this great bastion of left-wing ideals and progressiveness, and that's complete and utter nonsense. As I said before, up until relatively recently, only 5% of the population went to university. It was the place for elite, rich white men. That's what universities were. There was no this kind of, sometimes we kind of look back in the 60s and go, wasn't that the great time of the public university? The university was not for the public at all. It was for the elite. It was a very closed off, locked away space. The university has also been complicit. If you think about the notion of racism, the idea that I'm not fully human, a human being, right? Where does that? It doesn't come from the university in many ways. At first that's kind of biblical knowledge. There's lots of places these ideas come from, but where does that idea really give legitimacy and codified and tied to the body and proven in a sense? It's a university. Like, it really is a university. Like it is in these great Enlightenment figures. In fact, the book I'm publishing in February, The New Age of Empire, How Racism and Colonialism Still Rule the World, has a chapter called I'm White, Therefore I Am, right? Which goes back and looks at the Enlightenment. And it's literally every Enlightenment scholar had a racial theory, which all looked similar, which basically said black people are inferior, white people are superior, and there's this hierarchy in between. And we've kind of ignored that and tried to take their wonderful rational ideas and Kant's universal rights, and just forgotten the fact that they were the architects. This is the architects of the racism that we say that we're against, right? The idea that in the 21st century we have to say Black Lives Matter is you can't look any further. You have to go back to these Enlightenment scholars and ideals that we're still preaching, and that's where you find them really, really, really strongly. Black life doesn't matter. Black life is inferior. It is less than. There is this hierarchy of human beings. That's where those ideas are popular. And unfortunately, we still teach that same, essentially, that same structure of knowledge. So everything I've said about the university shouldn't come as a surprise. That they've never been progressive organizations. They've been institutions which have maintained the status quo until this 45. Racial science was just science, right? It was generally accepted, right? These ideas were generally accepted in the whole fields that we still use, like statistics, eugenics, some of the basic principles of IQ. Like, if it's all these things which are still there, where do they come from? Where's their intellectual heritage? In white supremacy, if we're honest, right? So when we're thinking about the university, then to decolonize that, would really mean to do much more social change than you can't. The university produces the way that it produces because it's produced by society which is based on white supremacy. Like, this is what it is. Like, that's why even now in the new age where you've got Black studies professors and we're still doing the same things, right? It still has predominantly the same role. It just looks a bit different, right? It's slightly more diverse. But if you think about particularly liberalism, etc., now that's been embedded in. It'd be difficult to argue that things are massively better on a structural level, right? Like, they're better in some ways, but structurally, what the university does, I think it would be a difficult argument to make it improve dramatically. So when we're talking, so that's why I always say I don't say decolonize, because decolonize means something else, right? What we are generally talking about when we have these conversations is Um, diversifying, right? We're talking about diversifying. We're saying, look, university, and this is where we have made progress, right? There has been progress. 5% of the population in the 60s, well, almost 50% of the student population. There's no chance you're gonna have black studies professors in 90s. It's unlikely now, to be honest. But certainly there's more black professors, there's more black academics and Asian academics. It's diverse. It looks different. It's much more diverse. Um, Obviously, I think you would probably guess from everything I've said. I don't think diversity is enough. I don't think that changes much. I make a big critique of diversity, but I would also say diversity is a good thing, right? And if we ask, and when we're talking about, you need different courses, you need different staff, you need the curriculum needs to shift and change and be much broader and reflect the population. These are all good things, right? So let's call them what it is and say, look, this is a good thing to do. We should go ahead and do this diversity project. But hopefully, if we do those things and then understand its diversity does not necessarily lead to transformation, then we can say, well, are there next steps we can take? Because if I think about Black Studies, for example, Black Studies for us attempts at least to be more transformative. So in terms of the way that knowledge is thought about, the intellectual history isn't this kind of Eurocentric knowledge. It's a very different way of thinking about intellectual history. The knowledge which is brought in this community. There's a 50-year history of Black Studies in the UK, in community, etc. And that's where this comes from. This the Black Studies work that we're doing comes from the British Black Power movement. That's the roots of it. And we brought that into the university. We get the students to go out and be involved in activism, and you're kind of teaching them how to do what we call the science of liberation. So the education they get, I would say, is very different, right? Structurally, it's very different. It looks different. It feels different. But I was only possible because of diversity, right? That was only possible because when I started in 2014, but we made a big push to say we have to have Black Studies, we have to employ different people, we have to get a different group of staff. So when I started in 2014, there's no way we could have run Black Studies. It was me and Dr. Dion Taylor, who's still at PC, and that was it. At that point, you can't run a 3-year degree to 2 people, right? So over the course started in 2017. So between those years, we were developing Black Studies research-wise, international recognition, etc., using that to recruit different people. And then in a 3-year period, again, just proving you can hire Black people, it's possible, right? We recruited like 3 Black people in a row. We went from 2 staff to 6 staff, and then we had a body of staff who could then say, let's run a course. So with that diversity, there's none of this. It's can't happen. So again, diversity is not a bad thing. It's something that's necessary. Let's call it what it is. Understand it's limited, and understand that we need to do more. But just call it what it is, right? These things are all important. So I would say that having pushing for diversity as a first step is certainly something that we need to do. But then even diversity, we need to think about diversity in its more structural diversity, right? So that is go and employ some staff, right? It's a really simple thing to do. Just employ some people, right? These are 2 things I've been recommending. Look, most of the stuff I write about is radical politics, so which is I think it's slightly different conversation. But the 2 things are 2 very simple, straightforward ways to make some kind of step in the right direction would be 1, employ some people, because that's doable. There are people out there, people need jobs. There's definitely enough. There's and I think there has been some change in that. So I think there are now, we're seeing jobs in like Black British history or Black literature and stuff like that. So I think we are starting to see a bit of that start to come in. And then the other thing is promote people. Always seniority. Like if you look at staff, there's a recognition now that people haven't been promoted and there's been a problem with promotion. And I was at a university I won't name, and they were like, well, we've seen this problem, we did a review, we know it's a problem. So what we're going to do is we're going to mentor staff. We're going to help mentor ethnic minority staff so they can put better applications in for promotion. So the idea is the reason you don't have more senior staff is because the staff aren't putting in good applications, which is frankly offensive and ludicrous. If you know people aren't being promoted, then guess what you should do? Promote them, right? It's really not that complicated. Just make a different system of the way that you do these things. Make a different system of judgment. I manage a number of people. I could tell you right now who should be promoted. It's not complicated. So some of those systems that we have in place are the problem, right? And we need to completely rethink how we do these systems. Right? And it's possible. There was one uni that had they found there was a gap between female professors' pay and male professors' pay. What did they do? They just equalized the pay. Like, you can do these things. There's ways to do these things. So these, I've kind of said it out. These are big structural issues, problems, and you need overhaul. And I believe all of these things. But on a basic level, there are really some quite straightforward things that can be done. It just should be done, and there are good things to do, and can be the starting point of going forward. And certainly, the staff is a big one, because particularly at university level, if you look at the attainment gap, for instance, there's work coming out in the attainment gap now, and one of the key things is the curriculum and the stuff that's taught. And I can't begin to describe how alienating it is, as somebody who went through probably the whitest psychology course in the history of ever, in terms of staff, in terms of content, in terms of everything about it, how alienating that is to somebody. I didn't understand this at the time, but only being taught that white men in particular could think and were worthy of study completely was depressing. I didn't get this at the time. At the time, I didn't really get it. I just thought, I don't really like this. I don't really engage with it. But looking back, it was actually a properly alienating experience. The only reason I am here today is because I went to the States and did Black psychology for a year, and completely transformed it. Black people can think, well, this is interesting stuff. I was really engaged. Honestly, I probably would have graduated. I certainly wouldn't have graduated enough, or had the interest in going into university, etc., etc. So actually, and at the university level, one area that, rather not like schools with the curriculum, the staff matters. Like, if you have different staff, you teach different stuff, right? This who's in the department really makes a massive difference. So it really is important, and not just getting Black people, because some Black people just don't do stuff which is any different than white scholars, right? So, but actually saying, look, if you have a history department, then you should have Black history in the department. It's quite important, right? And so I think that's really important. What knowledge is important? Who's in the place? Also, there's lots of evidence that around expectations. So just having Black staff is a different experience for students as well. I've never actually been taught by anybody who wasn't white, so I actually don't know. But the people who have been, they've always told me it's a different experience to have Black people and Asian people in the classroom teaching them, right? So the staffing issue is actually an issue which can help with the student issue as well. And it's just a really simple place to start. I think every university can do if it's committed to change.